There comes a moment in life when you realize the reason they couldn't love you, the reason they pushed you away, wasn't because you were flawed. Yeah, it was because you were too whole, too honest in a world that thrives on pretending, too loyal in a time when betrayal is easy, too pure for souls that had long abandoned the pursuit of truth. You didn't lose them. They lost you, and they did so deliberately, because your light made their shadows too visible, because your integrity exposed their games, because your soul was something they could never understand, only try to use or destroy. But hear this, you were never too much. You were just too real for people who built their identity on illusion. While they tried to make you doubt yourself, what they feared most was the mirror you held up to their faces, silently, bravely, and without apology. Purity is inner strength, not weakness. We live in a world where purity is often misunderstood, not because it is weak, but because it is rare. And anything rare becomes threatening to those who have long abandoned it. The pure of heart are not naive. They are not blind. They see the darkness. They feel the weight of betrayal. They recognize manipulation when it enters the room. But they choose not to mirror it. That is their quiet strength. The ability to remain clean in a world that would rather stain everyone to justify itself. Those who are corrupt in spirit often assume that anyone who doesn't fight dirty must be defenseless. But this is a grave misjudgment. The truth is, it takes far more strength to remain kind in the face of cruelty than it does to lash out. It takes far more courage to forgive, to understand, to walk away with dignity, than to stay and play the same destructive games. What they saw as softness was actually restraint. What they labeled as weakness was self-mastery, the hardest kind of power there is. You weren't passive, you were principled, and those principles acted like boundaries, silent but powerful. You weren't gullible, you were giving. You weren't weak, you were willing to carry more weight than most people even notice. You knew what it felt like to be wounded, and instead of using that pain to become bitter, you used it to understand others better. That is not fragility, that is refined humanity. It is strength shaped by suffering and made sacred by choice. But here lies the tragedy. People who live by shortcuts, by lies, by manipulation, they cannot comprehend that kind of strength, because in their world, power is about dominance. It's about control. It's about masking insecurity with aggression, dressing up shame with pride. So when they meet someone who doesn't play by those rules, someone who is anchored in truth, someone who refuses to stoop to their level, they don't respect it. They resent it because it calls their entire existence into question. You weren't too good for them in some arrogant, self-righteous way. You were too good for the games they insisted on playing. You were too honest for the masks they wore every day. You were too committed to growth to sit comfortably in their emotional stagnation. And they knew that. Deep down they sensed that your presence demanded a kind of accountability they were unwilling to meet. And so, instead of rising to your level, they pushed you down or pushed you out. This is why pure souls are often isolated, not because they're broken, but because they are whole in a world still bleeding from wounds it refuses to heal. They remind people of the work they haven't done, and instead of seeing that as an invitation to grow, most choose to attack what they don't understand. You weren't a threat because you were trying to change anyone. You became a threat the moment your existence exposed what they refused to change in themselves. But don't mistake their rejection for proof that you were wrong. Don't let their cruelty convince you to become someone you're not. The world may not immediately reward purity, but it will eventually reveal its worth. Because when the noise fades and the masks fall, people will remember how you made them feel. They will remember the quiet strength, the calm in your voice, the consistency of your heart, And they will realize that it was never weakness, it was wisdom wrapped in gentleness. You didn't lose by walking away. You preserved your peace. You protected something sacred within you. And those who thought they took advantage of your kindness will one day understand that what they mishandled was never naive. It was noble. You didn't fail by refusing to fight dirty. You rose above. You held the line when others collapsed. And that, in the end, is the kind of strength that outlasts every shallow form of power. So don't harden your heart just to fit into a world that's forgotten how to feel. Don't dilute your truth just to be accepted by those who can't face their own. If you were too pure, it's only because they were too afraid to confront the dirt in their own souls. That's not a reflection of your value. It's proof of your light. And that light deserves to keep burning, not to be dimmed for anyone's comfort. Hold on to your purity, not as a shield to hide behind, but as a sword of clarity in a fogged world. Let it be the reason you stand out, not the reason you shrink back. Because in the end, those who misjudged you will either be humbled by what they lost or haunted by what they failed to see. And you will still be standing, whole, unshaken, and proud of the soul you never sold. Moral decay rejects what it cannot. Not everyone walks away from you because of who you are. Many walk away because of what you refuse to become. When your character is anchored in integrity, you become immune to the manipulation that others use to control their environment. And when they cannot infect you, when they realize you won't mirror their dysfunction, they turn on you. They reject you not because you harmed them, but because you refuse to join them in harming others, in harming yourself, or in betraying your principles just to fit in. People who are steeped in moral decay don't seek connection, they seek compliance. They want others to silently tolerate their darkness, to nod along as they justify their actions, to applaud the mask they wear rather than question what lies beneath. And when they encounter someone who sees through the act, someone who doesn't judge but also doesn't excuse, they feel threatened, because purity, by its very nature, exposes corruption without needing to say a word. There is a strange discomfort that comes from being around someone who walks in truth when you've grown used to hiding. It feels like heat on a wound. It doesn't have to be loud to be confronting. You didn't have to say much. Your presence said everything. Your consistency, your refusal to gossip, your unwillingness to play power games, your loyalty even when others acted in secrecy. It all stood as a silent indictment against those who traded their soul for control. So they did what wounded people often do when they're exposed. They blamed you. They labeled your boundaries as arrogance. They called your silence passive aggression. They painted your truth as judgment, even when you never lifted a finger to condemn them, because in their world, there is no such thing as conviction without condemnation. They've forgotten what real accountability looks like. So when they feel it, they confuse it with attack. But here's the painful truth. You cannot heal what doesn't want to be healed. You cannot uplift what is committed to staying low. And you cannot walk alongside those who are walking in circles, not toward growth, but deeper into their own deception. They didn't reject you because you were harmful. They rejected you because you were clean, and they couldn't allow that purity to remain in a space they had already claimed for dysfunction. In a decaying moral landscape, purity becomes rebellion. Kindness becomes resistance. Truth becomes dangerous, because when you won't bend the truth to keep the peace, you expose the people who have built their lives on compromise. And when you continue to walk in your values even after being pushed away, You reveal that your strength didn't come from being accepted by them, it came from being grounded in something deeper. They wanted your agreement, not your authenticity. They wanted your silence, not your spirit. But you refused to shrink yourself just to soothe their guilt. And that's why they turned. That's why they couldn't handle your presence. Because when a soul becomes comfortable in its own rot, it sees healing as a threat, not a hope. You have to understand, moral decay is subtle. It doesn't always look like loud betrayal. Sometimes it shows up in the form of small lies, masked intentions, smiling faces that whisper slander when you're gone. And if you are someone who walks in truth, you begin to notice. Not because you're paranoid, but because purity has a sensitivity that corruption has long buried. You feel the tension in the room. You sense the shift when your presence demands people put their masks back on. And eventually you realize they were never uncomfortable because of something you did. They were uncomfortable because of something you revealed. This is why it's so vital to protect your inner clarity. Because in an environment where distortion is the norm, truth will always feel disruptive. But disruption is not destruction. Sometimes it is the beginning of cleansing. And even if they resist it, even if they exile you for it, the truth you carry will remain intact. It will grow, it will spread in silence. And one day it will return to them, not as a weapon, but as a mirror they can no longer avoid. You were not placed in their lives to be infected. You were placed to be a contrast. And that contrast scared them because deep down, they still remembered what it felt like to live with an honest heart. And your presence awakened that memory. But instead of embracing the invitation to return to it, they ran from it. That was not your failure. That was their choice. Let them run. Let them call you whatever they need to in order to feel justified, but never let their confusion become your burden. You knew who you were. You knew what you stood for, and you chose not to compromise, even when it meant standing alone. That's not loss. That's legacy. And long after they forget the lies they told about you, your truth will still be speaking, quietly, powerfully, unshaken. Your mirror, they couldn't bear to look into. There are few things more terrifying to a broken soul than a clear reflection, not a literal one, but a reflection of who they've become, held up by the presence of someone who still walks in truth. You didn't try to expose them. You didn't set out to make them uncomfortable. All you did was show up as you are, whole, honest, grounded, and that was enough to shatter the illusion they worked so hard to maintain. You became a mirror, and not everyone is ready to see what's staring back at them. When people spend years constructing masks, building defenses, and burying the parts of themselves they no longer want to face, they surround themselves with others who do the same. It creates a kind of mutual agreement. We don't call out each other's lies. We don't acknowledge each other's wounds, and we certainly don't reflect anything that demands change. Then you came along, and without even trying, you broke that agreement. You didn't play along with the performance. You didn't inflate their ego. You didn't laugh at the cruelty disguised as jokes or pretend not to notice the manipulations dressed as charm. You simply remained real. And that reality was unbearable to those who had long since detached from their own. You didn't shame them, but your authenticity made them feel ashamed. Not because you pointed a finger, but because your life silently pointed toward everything they had avoided. That's what mirrors do. They don't accuse, they reveal. And what they reveal depends on what the observer is ready or not ready to confront. Many people don't want healing, they want relief. And when they meet someone who is actually whole, who has done the painful inner work to become stable, compassionate, and clear, it challenges them because it shows that healing is possible, and suddenly their excuses lose power. Your emotional maturity, your refusal to retaliate, your quiet strength in the face of chaos, it all made it harder for them to keep hiding behind their pain. And so, instead of moving toward the light you carried, they resented it, they twisted it, they painted you as cold, distant, difficult. Because if they could make you wrong, they could stay right, even while living in the dark. They couldn't accept your reflection, so they had to shatter the mirror. That's why they turned. That's why the same honesty they once praised became too intense. That's why the same loyalty they leaned on became too much. You didn't change. Their tolerance for truth just ran out. People will often say they want realness, but what they really mean is comfort. And realness, especially the kind you embodied, was anything but comfortable. You weren't content with surface-level conversations, with relationships built on flattery and false peace. You cared too deeply to pretend, and that depth demanded a level of self-awareness they were not willing to meet. They weren't just rejecting you, they were rejecting what you reflected back to them. The parts of themselves that were still unhealed, the lies they told to survive, the values they had abandoned along the way. You triggered something ancient inside them, the memory of who they once were before pain distorted their vision. And instead of seeing you as a guide back to that place, they saw you as a threat to the life they had crafted around avoidance. And the tragedy is, you wanted to love them. You wanted to see them rise. You weren't standing in judgment. You were standing in hope. But they mistook your hope as pressure, your truth as threat, your grace as superiority. They couldn't hear your heart through the noise of their own inner conflict. When you live as a mirror, you will often be accused of things you never did. You'll be labeled with names that reflect their wounds, not your actions. Because for some, it's easier to destroy the reflection than to confront the reality it shows. But don't let that change you. Don't dim your light just because someone else refuses to open their eyes. And the mirror you became was not a weapon, it was a gift, one they weren't ready to receive. One day, maybe years from now, they will look back and realize what you were trying to give. They will remember the way your presence made them feel, both seen and unsettled, and they'll understand it wasn't because you were judging them, it was because you saw them fully, even when they couldn't see themselves. That kind of reflection is rare, and when people lose it, the silence that follows speaks louder than any words ever could. You were not too intense, you were just too honest for people who had spent too long hiding. You were not too emotional, you were just deeply alive in a world that numbs itself to survive. And you were not too pure. You were simply unwilling to become less just to make others feel more. So stand tall, keep reflecting truth, even if it costs you comfort, because somewhere out there, someone is still searching for a mirror, and when they're ready, they will see in you not a threat, but a doorway back to themselves. Being too much was exactly what the world needed. You've been called too much, more times than you can count. Too emotional, too intense, too honest, too sensitive, too passionate, too everything. And for a long time, you probably believed it. You questioned your depth. You tried to shrink your voice. You apologized for your presence. Because when the world constantly echoes the idea that your full self is inconvenient, it's easy to internalize the message that you must tone it down to be accepted. But here's what they never told you. Being too much, for them was never a flaw in you. It was a mirror to what they lacked. Your intensity challenged their numbness. Your emotional honesty disturbed their avoidance. Your passion made their apathy uncomfortable. And instead of rising to meet you in that place of truth, they told you to dim it. Not because you were wrong, but because they weren't ready for your kind of right. You weren't too emotional. You were emotionally literate in a world that confuses repression with strength. You weren't too intense. You were fiercely present in a culture addicted to distraction. You weren't too passionate. You were fully alive in spaces that reward emotional detachment. They called you too much because you felt too deeply, loved too sincerely, and dreamed too freely. And in doing so, you revealed just how numb, guarded, and disconnected others had become. What they failed to understand is that the world needs people like you. It needs the ones who still cry at truth, who still get chills when someone speaks from the heart, who still rage against injustice, not because they're unstable, but because they're awake. In a culture that often confuses sarcasm for intelligence and indifference for strength, your vulnerability was revolutionary. Your willingness to feel, to speak, to risk being misunderstood, that was power. That is power. People who are deeply alive often don't fit in easily, because fitting in often requires the very things you refuse to sacrifice: authenticity, conviction, emotion. You weren't made to blend into a gray world. You were made to bring color. You were made to disturb the surface, to stir stagnant waters, to pull conversations from the shallow into the deep. And that has always made people uncomfortable, not because you were wrong, but because you made silence impossible. You were the one who asked the questions no one else dared to, the one who saw the pain behind the smile, the one who felt the tension in the room and refused to pretend it wasn't there. You weren't trying to be dramatic. You were just unwilling to live a lie. And in a world built on quiet compromises, that kind of honesty can feel like rebellion. But let's be honest, carrying that weight hasn't been easy. You felt alone in crowded rooms. You've been misunderstood by people you only ever wanted to love. You've been told to calm down when your soul was on fire with truth. And for a while, you probably believed that if you could just be less, you might finally be enough for someone. But the truth is, anyone who needed you to shrink to stay was never meant to walk beside you in the first place. Your too much was never too much. It was exactly what the world needed, just not always what it wanted. The people who tried to silence you weren't rejecting your truth. They were avoiding their own. The ones who labeled your honesty as harshness, your sadness as weakness, your joy as excess, they weren't describing you. They were revealing their limits. You didn't come here to be easy to digest. You came here to shift something, to stir the hearts that have grown cold, to remind people that there is still wonder in the world, still depth in conversation, still beauty in feeling fully. You are not here to be palatable. You are here to be powerful. And sometimes power looks like softness in a harsh world. Sometimes it looks like crying when no one else will. Sometimes it looks like saying what everyone else is afraid to name. Yes, you've been too much. But too much love can heal a heart. Too much truth can break a chain. Too much courage can shift a generation. And too much presence can save a soul that's on the verge of giving up. The very things they criticized in you are the same things that will one day bring someone back to life. So stop apologizing for your fire. Stop second-guessing your intensity. Stop trying to water down your spirit just to avoid making others uncomfortable. If your presence rattles someone, it's because their cage was already too small. You weren't made to fit into broken systems. You were made to rebuild them with tenderness, with truth, and with the kind of heart that refuses to die, no matter how many times it's misunderstood. Let them call you too much, because one day someone will look at you, fully alive, unapologetically yourself, and say, "Where have you been all my life?" And you'll know you were never too much. You were always exactly enough for the ones who have finally awakened. Your absence will echo louder than your presence ever did. Sometimes it's not your words that leave the deepest impression. It's your silence. It's not your presence that breaks them. It's the moment they finally realize you're no longer within reach. You were always there, always showing up, always giving, even when you were running on empty. And they mistook that availability for permanence. They assumed your heart would always be there to catch what they constantly dropped. But there comes a day when even the most loyal soul stops knocking on a closed door, when even the most patient heart decides that silence is no longer peace, it's punishment. And when that moment arrives, you don't leave with noise. You don't announce your exit. You simply take back your energy, your light, your presence. And what's left behind is not just a void. It's a mirror of everything they never appreciated. They never realized how much space your love filled until it was gone. People often don't notice the weight you carry until you set it down. They don't understand the strength it takes to keep forgiving, to keep showing up, to keep choosing grace, until they're left to face their own reflection without the cushion of your compassion. That's when the echoes begin, not in loud regrets or dramatic apologies, but in the quiet moments of their everyday life, in the silence after a victory when there's no one to share it with, in the loneliness that follows their laughter, when it no longer reaches the person who once made them feel seen. Your absence becomes the loudest truth they can't unhear. It's easy to overlook someone when they're always there. It's easy to take their kindness for granted, to assume their loyalty is guaranteed. But what they never understood is that your presence wasn't owed, it was a gift. A gift wrapped in patience, empathy, and deep emotional investment. And when that gift is withdrawn, the space it once filled doesn't just vanish, it haunts, because now they're left with their own silence, and for the first time, they're forced to sit with what they tried to avoid. The reality that they were never entitled to your soul. You weren't just another person passing through. You were a home they never learned how to live in. You were a calm in the middle of their chaos, a truth in the midst of their confusion. You offered peace in a world that taught them to survive on conflict. And because they didn't know what to do with that kind of stillness, they created noise to drown it out. But now that you're gone, they miss the very quiet they once ran from. That's the irony. They didn't understand you when they had you, and now they're haunted by a presence they can no longer feel, but can never forget. There's a kind of power in walking away without bitterness. When you leave, not to punish, but to protect your peace, that's when your absence becomes transformational. You didn't leave to hurt them. You left because staying was hurting you. And in choosing yourself, you forced them to finally confront what they avoided for so long, that you were not a constant in their life, but a choice. And once that choice disappeared, the loss became undeniable. They may try to replace you. They may try to fill the void with noise, distractions, or new faces, but none of it will match the depth of what you gave so freely. Because you didn't just offer company, you offered connection. You didn't just listen, you understood. You didn't just exist beside them, you poured life into their world. And when a soul like that goes silent, no amount of sound can cover the loss. That's when the echo begins, in the late night moments when distractions fade, in the spaces where your laughter once lived, in the eyes of others who can't replicate the kind of truth you carried in your gaze. They remember the depth, the stability, the unwavering presence that once held their chaos without judgment. They remember and they regret. But you're not responsible for their awakening. Your role was never to fix what they refused to face. Your role was to be authentic, to love fully, and to walk away when that love was no longer met with care. You were not too much. You were just too real for people who were still hiding from their own truth. Now, your absence is teaching them what your presence couldn't. That not everyone stays, that love is not a guarantee, that silence, when it comes from someone who once fought so hard to be heard, is louder than any goodbye. And maybe, just maybe, they'll grow because of it. Maybe they'll finally face the parts of themselves they avoided. Maybe the echo of your absence will wake them up. But that's no longer your concern. You've done your part. You showed up, you gave your heart, you stood tall in rooms that tried to shrink you, and when it was time to go, you did so without burning the bridge. You just stopped crossing it. And now your silence speaks for itself.